Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood in the hangar bay, staring at the rows of sleek fighter jets that gleamed under the artificial lights. Around her, pilots from a dozen different alien species were making their selections for the upcoming mission. The Zephyrian pilots, with their forearms and crystal blue skin, naturally gravitated toward the multi-weapon Stormbirds. The insectoid Thrax chose the heavily armored destroyers, their compound eyes scanning every detail of the massive ships. Sarah walked past all of them, her boots echoing on the metal floor. She could hear the whispers starting behind her. The other pilots knew where she was heading, and they thought she had lost her mind. In the far corner of the hangar, covered in dust and sitting alone, was her choice. The other humans in her squadron shook their heads as she approached it. Even Captain Rodriguez, her commanding officer, had tried to talk her out of it during the briefing. "Chen, you're making a mistake," called out Flight Leader Vex, a tall Zephyrian with silver markings on his forehead. "That thing hasn't been used in real combat for over 50 years. It's a museum piece." Sarah ran her hand along the hull of the ship she had chosen. It was smaller than the others, with clean lines and a design that looked almost ancient compared to the modern fighters around it. The paint was faded, and there were patches where repairs had been made over the decades, but Sarah could see something the others couldn't. The Ghosthawk? Lieutenant Kim Park, another human pilot, walked up beside her. "Sarah, seriously? That thing doesn't even have energy shields. One hit from a plasma cannon and you're space dust." Sarah smiled and continued her inspection. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, Kim. Trust me on this one." The mission briefing had been clear. The enemy fleet had taken control of the asteroid mining station at Kepler 442. Intelligence suggested they had at least 200 fighters protecting the station, along with defensive turrets that could punch through the shields of most ships. The multi-species fleet would need to punch through those defenses and retake the station before the enemy could extract the rare minerals needed for their weapon systems. Commander Thorne, a grizzled veteran with more combat experience than anyone else in the fleet, had given them their orders. Each pilot could choose their ship based on their preferred combat style. Most went for the obvious choices, the newest, most powerful fighters with the best weapons and strongest shields. Sarah had different ideas. She climbed into the cockpit of the Ghosthawk and immediately felt at home. The controls were simpler than the modern ships, with physical switches and analog displays instead of holographic interfaces. The seat was worn leather instead of molded polymer. Everything about it felt real and solid. "Final flight check in 10 minutes, came the announcement over the comm system. Around the hangar, pilots were running through their pre-flight sequences. The modern ships hummed and whirred as their systems came online. Weapon systems charged, shields activated, and engines began their warm-up cycles. Sarah's Ghosthawk was almost silent. She flipped a few switches, checked her gauges, and was ready to go in less than 2 minutes. The ship's systems were so simple that there wasn't much to check. Engine, fuel, life support, weapons. That was it. "Chen, what's your status?" Commander Thorne's voice crackled through her headset. "Ready for launch, sir," Sarah replied. She could hear some chuckling over the open channel. Lieutenant Vex's voice came through clearly. "I give her 5 minutes before she has to eject. That ancient piece of junk won't last 30 seconds against modern fighters." More laughter followed. Even some of the human pilots joined in. Sarah had always been different from the others. While they studied the latest tactical manuals and trained on virtual reality simulators, Sarah spent her free time in the archives, reading about old battles and studying the techniques used by pilots from earlier generations. "All fighters, prepare for launch," came the command. One by one, the modern fighters roared to life. Their engines created brilliant blue flames as they lifted off the hangar deck and shot out into space. Sarah watched them go, their sleek forms disappearing into the star field beyond the force field that kept the hangar pressurized. When her turn came, Sarah gently pushed the throttle forward. The Ghosthawk's engine came to life with a low, steady rumble. There were no flashy special effects, no brilliant flames, just the reliable sound of an engine that had been built to last. As she guided the ship out of the hangar, Sarah could see the enemy fleet in the distance. The asteroid mining station was surrounded by a cloud of enemy fighters, their red running lights creating a deadly constellation against the black of space. The defensive turrets on the station itself were already tracking their approach, charging up for the coming battle. "All fighters, form up on me," Commander Thorne ordered. "Remember, our job is to clear a path for the bombers. Stay tight, watch each other's backs, and let's bring everyone home." Sarah fell into formation with the rest of the squadron. She could see the other pilots in their modern fighters, their ships bristling with weapons and protected by energy shields that glowed faintly around their hulls. Next to them, her Ghosthawk looked like it belonged in a different century. "Enemy fighters incoming," called out the sensor operator. "Count shows 200 plus, moving to intercept." Sarah checked her weapons one more time. No energy weapons, no guided missiles, no smart bombs. Just two old-fashioned kinetic cannons and her own skill as a pilot. The enemy was going to have every advantage. Numbers, technology, firepower. But as she watched the enemy formation approaching, Sarah smiled. They were flying in perfect formation, using all the standard tactics that were taught in every military academy in the galaxy. They relied on their computers, their targeting systems, their advanced technology. They had no idea what was coming their way. The first enemy fighters opened fire, sending streams of plasma bolts racing across space. The modern ships in Sarah's squadron activated their shields and returned fire, the battle erupting into a brilliant light show of energy weapons and explosions. Sarah kept her distance for the moment, watching and learning. She could see the patterns in how the enemy moved, the way they relied on their technology to do their thinking for them. This was going to be even easier than she had hoped. The space battle erupted into chaos within seconds. Modern fighters danced through streams of plasma fire, their energy shields flashing as they absorbed hits. The enemy had taken the bait, spreading their formation wide to engage what they thought was a standard attack formation. Sarah held back, watching the patterns. The enemy fighters moved in predictable ways, following doctrine that was probably programmed into their flight computers. When attacked from the right, they banked left. When missiles locked onto them, they deployed countermeasures and followed evasive pattern Alpha 7. She had studied these tactics in the old war records. "Chen, where are you?" Lieutenant Park's voice crackled over the comm. "We could use some help up here." "Coming in from high," Sarah replied, finally pushing her throttle forward. The Ghosthawk accelerated smoothly, without the violent thrust that the modern ships produced. Sarah angled down toward the battle, approaching from above where most of the enemy sensors would be focused on the main fight below. Her first target was a sleek enemy interceptor that was pursuing one of the human fighters. The enemy pilot was completely focused on his prey, probably trusting his rear sensors to warn him of any threats from behind. But the Ghosthawk was old enough that its engine signature didn't match anything in the enemy's computer database. Sarah lined up her shot carefully. No targeting computer, no smart weapons, just her eyes, her instincts, and two kinetic cannons that fired simple metal slugs at incredible velocity. She squeezed the trigger. The enemy interceptor simply ceased to exist. The kinetic rounds punched through its hull like it was made of paper, and the ship exploded in a brilliant flash. The enemy had been so focused on their energy shields that they had forgotten about old-fashioned physical projectiles. "Nice shot, Chen," Park called out. "How did you get through his shields like that?" Sarah was already lining up her second target. "What shields?" She dove toward another enemy fighter, this one trying to get a missile lock on a Zephyrian pilot. The enemy ship was flying in a straight line, making itself an easy target while its computer calculated the perfect firing solution. Sarah's second burst caught the enemy fighter in its engine compartment. Without shields to stop the kinetic rounds, the ship broke apart, its wreckage tumbling through space. "Two down," she reported calmly. Around her, the battle was going differently than anyone had expected. The modern fighters were holding their own, but they were taking heavy damage. Energy shields could only absorb so much punishment before they failed, and the enemy had numbers on their side. But Sarah's approach was causing confusion in the enemy ranks. Ships were exploding without any energy signatures to track, no missile launches to detect. Their computers couldn't understand what was happening. "Unknown contact, your ship doesn't match any signatures in our database," came a transmission on the enemy frequency. "Identify yourself." Sarah switched to the enemy channel. "This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Earth Defense Corps. You can call me the Ghosthawk." She banked hard to the left, avoiding a stream of plasma fire from two enemy fighters that had finally noticed her. They were trying to track her, but the Ghosthawk was smaller and more maneuverable than they expected. Sarah had spent months learning to fly without computer assistance, using only her instincts and reflexes. The enemy fighters split up, trying to box her in. It was a standard tactic, and Sarah had been expecting it. Instead of trying to escape, she turned directly toward the nearest enemy ship. The enemy pilot probably couldn't believe what his sensors were telling him. The human was flying straight at him in an ancient ship with no shields and no energy weapons. It had to be some kind of mistake. Sarah fired at point-blank range. The kinetic rounds tore through the enemy cockpit, and the ship went silent, drifting lifeless through space. 3 down, she reported. Chen, whatever you're doing, keep it up. Commander Thorne's voice came through the comm. You're causing quite a stir over there. Sarah could see that he was right. The enemy formation was beginning to break apart as pilots tried to figure out how to deal with a threat their computers couldn't identify or track properly. Some of them were even firing at empty space, their targeting systems completely confused. She spotted a group of enemy fighters closing in on a damaged human bomber. The bomber's shields were down, and it was leaking atmosphere from several hull breaches. The enemy pilots were moving in for the kill. Sarah pushed her throttle to maximum and dove toward the fight. The Ghosthawk's engine responded instantly, without the lag time that plagued the computer-controlled modern ships. She arrived just as the lead enemy fighter was lining up for the killing shot. Her first burst caught the enemy ship and its weapon systems, disabling its guns. The second burst destroyed its engines. The third enemy fighter tried to turn to face her, but Sarah was already moving, banking around to come at it from a different angle. The dogfight that followed was unlike anything the other pilots had ever seen. Sarah flew the Ghosthawk like it was an extension of her own body, making turns and maneuvers that should have been impossible for a ship that size. The enemy pilot was skilled, but he was fighting a battle his training had never prepared him for. Without energy weapons to track, without missiles to detect, without a computer signature to lock onto, the enemy pilot was essentially flying blind. Sarah, on the other hand, was using skills that human pilots had developed over centuries of atmospheric flight, adapted for space combat. She came out of a spiraling dive and caught the enemy fighter with a perfect deflection shot, leading her target just enough to compensate for its movement. The enemy ship broke apart under the impact of her kinetic rounds. Bomber 7 is clear, she reported. 4 down, but Sarah wasn't done yet. She could see the patterns in the enemy formation, the way they were trying to adapt to her presence. They were good pilots, but they were thinking like machines, following programmed responses to threats they recognized. Sarah was about to show them what human creativity could accomplish in combat. She banked toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters, ready to put everything she had learned into practice. The real fight was just beginning. Sarah accelerated toward the main enemy formation, her mind already calculating angles and velocities. The enemy had regrouped into a defensive sphere around their command ship, a massive cruiser that was coordinating the entire battle. It was a textbook formation, designed to provide maximum protection with overlapping fields of fire. Chen, what are you doing? Commander Thorne's voice carried a note of concern. You're heading straight into their main force. I see a weakness in their formation, sir, Sarah replied, adjusting her approach slightly. Trust me on this one. The weakness wasn't visible to the others because it required thinking like a pilot from an earlier era. The enemy formation was perfect for defending against energy weapons and guided missiles, but it had a blind spot that only kinetic weapons could exploit. As Sarah approached, the enemy fighters opened fire. Streams of plasma bolts lit up space around her, but she was flying an evasive pattern that her grandmother might have recognized. It was based on techniques developed by Earth pilots during the old atmospheric wars, before computers took over the job of flying. The first plasma bolt passed so close to her cockpit that she could see its glow through the canopy. Sarah rolled the Ghosthawk 90 degrees and dove beneath the formation, using the enemy ships themselves as cover against their own crossfire. Impossible, she heard one of the enemy pilots mutter over the open channel. No one can fly like that. Sarah smiled as she lined up her next shot. The enemy command ship's escorts were too close together, their formation designed to stop attacks from long range. But Sarah was already inside their defensive perimeter, where their own ships blocked their ability to target her effectively. She fired at the nearest escort, her kinetic rounds punching through its hull and into its reactor core. The explosion lit up space, temporarily blinding the sensors of the nearby ships. 5 down, Sarah reported, already moving to her next target. The enemy formation was starting to break apart as individual pilots tried to track her movement. Their computers were giving them conflicting information. unable to predict where she would be next because her flight pattern didn't match any known doctrine. Sarah banked hard to the left and climbed above the formation, putting herself in position to attack the command ship directly. But as she approached, she noticed something that made her change her plan. The command ship had powered up its main guns and was targeting the human flagship. If those guns fired, Commander Thorne's ship wouldn't survive the hit. "Command ship is charging weapons," Sarah called out. All ships evasive maneuvers, but the human flagship was too big and too slow to dodge in time. Sarah could see the energy building in the enemy gun barrels, the targeting systems locking onto their target. She made a decision that would have been called insane by any military academy in the galaxy. Instead of attacking the command ship, Sarah turned toward its main guns and flew directly into their line of fire. "Chen, what are you doing?" Multiple voices shouted over the comm. Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy timing her approach perfectly. The enemy guns fired just as she reached the optimal position, their massive energy beams passing harmlessly on either side of the tiny Ghosthawk. But Sarah wasn't trying to avoid the beams. She was using them. The massive energy discharge temporarily overloaded every sensor in the area, creating a brief window where even the most advanced targeting computers couldn't track anything. In that moment of blindness, Sarah fired everything she had at the command ship's bridge. Her kinetic rounds struck home just as the sensors came back online. The command ship's bridge exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, and suddenly the entire enemy formation lost coordination. "6 down," Sarah called out, but she was already looking for her next target. The enemy fighters were starting to panic. Without their command ship to coordinate them, they were falling back on individual combat protocols. Some tried to retreat, others formed smaller groups, and a few brave pilots came after Sarah directly. It was exactly what she had been hoping for. Sarah dove toward the asteroid mining station, drawing the pursuing fighters into the station's defensive fire zone. The automated turrets opened fire on everything that wasn't transmitting the proper identification codes, which included both Sarah and her pursuers. But Sarah had studied the turret placement during the mission briefing. She knew their blind spots, their reaction times, their maximum tracking speeds. She flew a path that kept her just ahead of their targeting solutions while leading the enemy fighters directly into their field of fire. The first pursuing fighter was destroyed by a defensive turret that mistook it for an attacking ship. The second tried to break off, but Sarah had anticipated that move and cut off its escape route, forcing it to continue into the kill zone. 7 down, she reported as the second fighter exploded. 8 down came a moment later as another turret found its mark. The remaining enemy fighters finally realized what was happening and tried to retreat from the station's defensive perimeter. But Sarah wasn't done with them yet. She used the station's bulk to hide her approach, flying so close to its surface that her wingtips almost scraped the metal. The station's own defensive sensors lost track of her in the visual clutter of its superstructure. When she emerged on the other side, she was directly behind a formation of retreating enemy fighters. They had no idea she was there until her kinetic rounds started tearing through their rear formations. 9 down, 10 down, 11 down, Sarah called out in quick succession. The enemy formation completely collapsed. Some fighters scattered in all directions. Others tried to form defensive groups, and a few brave pilots turned to face her directly. Sarah was ready for all of them. The Ghosthawk might have been an old design, but in the hands of a pilot who understood its capabilities, it was still one of the most dangerous ships in space. Sarah had proven that technology wasn't everything, that sometimes the old ways were the best ways, but the battle wasn't over yet. The enemy still had numbers on their side, and they were starting to adapt to her tactics. Sarah could see them regrouping in the distance, probably developing new strategies to deal with her unconventional approach. She checked her ammunition and fuel levels. Both were running lower than she would have liked, but she still had enough for several more engagements. The question was whether the rest of the fleet could take advantage of the chaos she had created. The enemy was learning. Sarah could see it in their new formation patterns, the way they were spreading out to deny her the close-range advantage she had been exploiting. They were also starting to use more primitive targeting methods, relying on visual contact instead of computer sensors that couldn't track her properly. "All fighters, form up on the Ghosthawk." Commander Thorne's voice came through the comm. "Chen has shown us the way. Time to press our advantage." Sarah felt a surge of pride as she saw the rest of the fleet moving to support her. The modern fighters were adapting their tactics, switching off their automated systems and flying more aggressively. The enemy's temporary confusion was exactly the opening they needed. "Roger that, Commander," Sarah replied. "I'll take point." She banked toward the regrouping enemy formation, but this time she wasn't alone. A dozen human fighters followed her lead, their pilots having learned from watching her unconventional approach. Behind them came the alien ships, each species bringing their own unique advantages to the fight. The enemy opened fire as they approached, but something had changed. The plasma bolts were less accurate, the missile locks were taking longer to achieve. The enemy was still dangerous, but they had lost the overwhelming technological advantage they had started with. Sarah led the charge directly into their formation. The Ghosthawk's small size and maneuverability allowed her to thread between enemy ships, her kinetic weapons punching holes in their ranks. The other human pilots followed her example, switching to manual flight control and relying on their instincts instead of their computers. 12 down, Sarah called out as her rounds found another target. But she could see that the enemy was adapting faster than she had hoped. A group of their best pilots had formed a hunting pack specifically to target her. They were flying older ships probably pulled from reserve units that didn't rely as heavily on automated systems. "Chen, you've got company," Lieutenant Park warned. 6 fighters closing fast from your 4 o'clock. Sarah glanced at her tactical display and immediately understood the threat. These enemy pilots weren't following standard doctrine. They were flying like she was, using instinct and skill instead of computer assistance. "I see them," Sarah replied, banking hard to the right. This should be interesting. The dogfight that followed was the kind of pure pilot versus pilot combat that hadn't been seen in decades. No smart weapons, no computer targeting, no energy shields to rely on. Just skill, reflexes, and the will to win. Sarah found herself in a turning fight with the lead enemy pilot, both ships spiraling through space in increasingly tight circles as each tried to get behind the other. The enemy pilot was good, probably their best, but Sarah had been training for this kind of combat her entire career. She let the enemy pilot think he was gaining an advantage, allowing him to close the distance between them. At the last second, she cut her engines and hit her maneuvering thrusters, causing the Ghosthawk to suddenly reverse direction. The enemy pilot shot past her, and Sarah was suddenly behind him with a perfect firing solution. Her kinetic round struck his ship's engine compartment, and another enemy fighter became space debris. 13 down, she reported. But she didn't have time to celebrate. The other 5 enemy fighters were closing in, trying to overwhelm her with numbers. Sarah pushed the Ghosthawk into a series of maneuvers that would have been impossible for the larger, more automated ships. She rolled, dove, climbed, and turned in patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully calculated to keep her enemies from getting a clear shot. One of the enemy pilots tried to anticipate her movement and fired where he thought she would be. Sarah wasn't there, but Lieutenant Park was, and his ship took a direct hit. His fighter exploded in a ball of flame that lit up Sarah's cockpit. "Park is down," someone called over the comm. "Kim is gone." Sarah felt a surge of anger. Kim Park had been a good pilot and a good friend. She had followed Sarah into this battle, trusting her judgment, and now she was dead. Sarah's flying became more aggressive, more dangerous. She flew directly at the nearest enemy fighter, not bothering to evade its fire. The enemy pilot's shots went wide, probably because he couldn't believe anyone would be crazy enough to attack head-on without shields. Sarah's return fire didn't miss. The enemy fighter disintegrated under the impact of her kinetic rounds. 14 down, she said quietly. The remaining enemy fighters tried to retreat, but Sarah wasn't going to let them escape. She pursued them across the battlefield, using every trick she had learned about space combat. She used debris from destroyed ships as cover, timed her attacks to coincide with the enemy's reloading cycles, and exploited every weakness in their formation. 15 down, 16 down, 17 down, she called out as her ammunition found its marks. The last enemy fighter tried a desperate gambit, diving toward the asteroid mining station and hoping its defensive turrets would destroy Sarah before she could finish him off. But Sarah had already demonstrated her ability to navigate the station's defenses, and she followed him into the turret field without hesitation. The final dogfight took place among the station's superstructure, both ships weaving between communication arrays and docking ports while turrets fired at anything that moved. Sarah's superior knowledge of the station's layout gave her the advantage she needed. Her final burst caught the enemy fighter as it tried to hide behind a fuel depot. The ship exploded so close to the station that the shockwave rattled her cockpit windows. 18 down, Sarah reported. Enemy hunting pack is eliminated. She pulled away from the station and surveyed the larger battle. The tide had definitely turned. The enemy fleet was in full retreat, their coordination completely broken. The human and alien fighters were pursuing them across the system, but Sarah could see that the main threat was over. Outstanding work, Chen. Commander Thorne's voice came through the comm. I've never seen flying like that in 40 years of combat. Sarah checked her ammunition count. She was down to her last few rounds and her fuel was running low, but the mission was accomplished. The mining station was back in their hands, and the enemy fleet was scattered. Just doing my job. Sir, Sarah replied. As she turned toward the rally point, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the cockpit canopy. She looked exactly the same as when the battle had started, but something fundamental had changed. She had proven that human ingenuity and skill could triumph over superior technology. More importantly, she had honored the memory of all the pilots who had flown ships like the Ghosthawk before her. The old ways weren't obsolete. They were just waiting for the right pilot to show their true potential. The battle was won, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Word of what had happened here would spread throughout the galaxy, and everyone would want to know about the human pilot who had turned an obsolete fighter into the most feared ship in space. 3 weeks after the battle at Kepler 442, Sarah found herself in a very different kind of fight. Instead of enemy fighters, she was facing a room full of military officials, weapons manufacturers, and tactical analysts who all wanted to understand how she had accomplished the impossible. Lieutenant Chen, Admiral Harrison leaned forward across the briefing table. According to the battle reports, you destroyed 18 enemy fighters in a ship that most experts consider obsolete. Some of our allies are calling it impossible. Sarah sat quietly in her chair, still wearing her flight suit. She had been pulled directly from a training exercise to attend this emergency briefing. Around the table sat representatives from every major military force in the Alliance, along with executives from the companies that built their weapons. It wasn't impossible, sir, Sarah replied simply. It just required a different approach. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief engineer from Stellar Defense Systems, shook his head. Lieutenant, I helped design the current generation of fighters. Their energy shields alone should have made them invulnerable to kinetic weapons. How did you penetrate their defenses? Sarah glanced around the room at the confused faces staring back at her. These were some of the smartest people in the galaxy, but they had all forgotten something fundamental about combat. They didn't have shields up against kinetic weapons, Sarah explained. Their defensive systems were designed to stop energy attacks and guided missiles. Simple ballistic projectiles weren't even considered a threat. But that's because kinetic weapons are obsolete, protested General Vex, the Zephyrian military representative. They have limited range, no smart targeting, and require direct line of sight. No modern pilot would choose them over energy weapons, Sarah smiled. That's exactly why they worked, sir. The enemy made the same assumption you just did. She stood up and walked to the holographic display at the front of the room. With a few gestures, she called up a tactical replay of the battle. Look at their formation patterns. Sarah pointed to the enemy ships on the display. Perfect for defending against long-range energy attacks. But they left themselves completely vulnerable to close-range kinetic fire. The replay showed her diving through the enemy formation, her Ghosthawk weaving between ships that couldn't track her properly. Every shot she fired found its target, because she was attacking from angles their computers hadn't been programmed to defend against. Your unconventional tactics created chaos in their ranks, Admiral Harrison observed. But Lieutenant, you were also incredibly lucky. One hit would have destroyed your ship. Luck had nothing to do with it, sir, Sarah replied. I studied their combat doctrine for months before that mission. I knew exactly how they would react to every situation. She changed the display to show historical data from previous battles. The enemy has been using the same tactical manual for over 20 years. Their pilots are trained to rely on computer assistance for everything. When I took away their technological advantage, they didn't know how to adapt. Commander Thorne, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. What Lieutenant Chen accomplished out there was more than just tactics. She demonstrated that human pilots still have advantages that no computer can replicate. Explain, Admiral Harrison commanded. Sarah returned to her seat. Intuition, creativity, the ability to see patterns that computers miss. Modern fighters are incredibly powerful, but they've made their pilots dependent on technology. Take away the computers and many pilots don't know how to fight. Dr. Webb was taking notes frantically. But surely you can't suggest that we abandon our technological advantages. Our modern fighters are superior in every measurable way. I'm not suggesting we abandon anything, Sarah replied. I'm suggesting we remember that technology is a tool, not a replacement for skill. The Ghosthawk worked because I knew how to use its limitations as advantages. She gestured to the display again. Look at this engagement here. 3 enemy fighters trying to box me in using standard intercept protocol. Their computers calculated the perfect positions to trap any normal ship. But the Ghosthawk isn't normal. It's small enough and agile enough to escape through gaps that their targeting system said were impossible. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Alliance had spent decades developing increasingly sophisticated fighters, but they had neglected to train pilots who could function without that sophistication. Lieutenant, Admiral Harrison said slowly, are you saying that our entire approach to space combat is flawed? Sarah chose her words carefully. I'm saying that we've become predictable, sir. Our tactics are based on having superior technology. But what happens when we face an enemy with technology that's equal to ours? Or when our computers are compromised? General Vex leaned back in his chair. You're talking about fundamental changes to how we train pilots, how we design ships, how we fight wars. Yes, sir, I am, Sarah replied without hesitation. The room erupted in discussion. Some officials were intrigued by the possibilities. Others were skeptical, and a few seemed downright hostile to the idea that their precious technology might not be the answer to every problem. Dr. Webb raised his hand for silence. Lieutenant Chen, would you be willing to participate in a series of tests? We'd like to see if your results can be replicated by other pilots using similar tactics. Sarah nodded. Of course, sir. But I'd like to make a request. Go ahead, Admiral Harrison said. I want to train a squadron of pilots using old-school techniques. No computer assistance, no smart weapons, no energy shields. Just skill, instinct, and kinetic weapons. The room went quiet again. What Sarah was proposing was essentially a return to combat methods that had been abandoned decades ago. That's highly irregular, General Vex protested. It goes against everything we've learned about modern warfare. So did flying the Ghosthawk into combat, Sarah replied. And that worked out pretty well. Admiral Harrison studied her for a long moment. What would you need for this training program? Sarah had been hoping for this question. 12 volunteers, access to a flight of old fighters, and permission to ignore current tactical doctrine. Give me 6 months and I'll show you what human pilots can really accomplish. Dr. Webb was shaking his head. Admiral, this is madness. We can't just abandon decades of technological advancement based on one lucky engagement. It wasn't luck, Commander Thorne interjected. I've reviewed the combat footage frame by frame. Every move Lieutenant Chen made was calculated. Every shot was precisely aimed. She didn't get lucky 18 times in a row. Admiral Harrison made his decision. Lieutenant Chen, you have your squadron. But I want results, not just theories. Can you guarantee that your methods will work against modern opponents? Sarah stood up and saluted. Sir, give me those volunteers and 6 months of training, and I'll prove that the old ways are still the best ways. As she left the briefing room, Sarah could hear the heated discussions continuing behind her. Some people would never accept that technology wasn't the answer to every problem, but she was going to prove them wrong, one dogfight at a time. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a new hangar bay watching 12 pilots perform maintenance on their fighters. But these weren't the gleaming modern ships that filled most military hangars. These were restored Ghosthawks, each one pulled from storage and carefully rebuilt to original specifications. Her squadron had been nicknamed the Ghost Squadron by the other pilots on the base. And not always in a friendly way, many of the modern pilots thought Sarah and her volunteers were wasting their time with obsolete equipment and outdated tactics. Squadron leader, Lieutenant Torres approached, wiping grease from his hands. All ships are ready for the demonstration. Admiral Harrison's inspection team just arrived. Sarah nodded, checking her watch. The next few hours would determine whether her unconventional training program would be expanded or quietly shut down. The Alliance military had given her 6 months to prove that old-fashioned combat techniques could work against modern opponents. She walked down the line of Ghosthawks, inspecting each one. Her pilots had learned to maintain their own ships, understanding every system and component. They could troubleshoot problems that would leave modern pilots stranded, waiting for computer diagnostics and technical specialists. "Listen up, Ghost Squadron," Sarah called out. "Today we proved that everything we've worked for was worth it. Remember your training. Trust your instincts. Fly like your life depends on it, because in real combat it will." The pilots gathered around her were a diverse group. Some were experienced veterans who had volunteered out of curiosity. Others were young hotshots who had been struggling with the computer-dependent modern fighters. All of them had learned to fly without technological assistance over the past 6 months. Lieutenant Maria Santos raised her hand. "Squadron leader, what exactly are we up against today?" Sarah smiled. "Admiral Harrison has arranged for us to face the Academy's top graduating class. 12 of the best new pilots in the Alliance flying the latest Mark 7 Starhawks. Energy shields, smart weapons, computer targeting, the works." A few of the pilots exchanged worried glances. The Mark 7 was the most advanced fighter in the Alliance arsenal. Its computer systems could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously, and its energy shields could absorb incredible amounts of damage. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Chen spoke up, "those Mark 7s have every advantage. How are we supposed to compete?" "The same way I beat them at Kepler 442, Sarah replied. "By being unpredictable, by using our limitations as advantages, by remembering that computers can only react to what they're programmed to expect." She gestured toward the hangar doors, where the inspection team was entering. Admiral Harrison led the group, followed by the same collection of officials and engineers who had questioned her 6 months earlier. "Remember," Sarah told her pilots, "they think we're going to lose. They think these old ships are useless relics. Let's show them what human creativity can accomplish." The pilots climbed into their cockpits, and Sarah did a final systems check on her own Ghosthawk. Everything was exactly as it should be: simple, reliable, and ready for combat. As the squadron launched from the hangar, Sarah could see the Academy ships forming up in the distance. The Mark 7s were beautiful machines, their hulls gleaming in the starlight, their energy fields creating soft halos around each ship. "Ghost Leader, this is Academy 1, came a transmission from the opposing force. "We're ready to begin the exercise whenever you are." Sarah switched to the command frequency. "Admiral Harrison, Ghost Squadron is ready for demonstration." "Very well, Lieutenant Chen. This will be a standard engagement scenario. First squadron to eliminate all opposing fighters wins. Rules of engagement are simulation mode only. No live weapons," Sarah acknowledged and switched back to her squadron frequency. "All right, Ghosts. Remember what we practiced. Stay loose, stay unpredictable, and don't let them box you in." The Mark 7s approached in perfect formation, their sensors probably already tracking every Ghosthawk and calculating optimal attack vectors. Sarah could imagine the computer displays in their cockpits showing targeting solutions and tactical recommendations. "Academy 1 to all Academy ships," came the transmission. "Standard intercept formation. Engage when in range," Sarah almost laughed. They were treating this exactly like a textbook engagement, probably because their instructors had never taught them to deal with anything else. "Ghost Squadron, split up and attack from multiple vectors," Sarah ordered. "Don't give them a concentrated target." The Ghosthawks scattered, each pilot choosing their own approach angle. The Academy pilots tried to maintain their formation, but Sarah could see their uncertainty as the expected attack pattern failed to materialize. The first engagement came when Lieutenant Torres dove at the Academy formation from above. The Mark 7s turned to intercept him, their computer targeting systems locking onto his ship. But Torres wasn't flying in a straight line or following any predictable pattern. He rolled, dove, and climbed in a sequence that looked random, but was actually carefully designed to confuse targeting computers. The Academy pilots fired where their computers said he would be, but Torres wasn't there. His return fire caught one of the Mark 7s completely by surprise. The simulation registered a kill, and the Academy ship's systems shut down. "First kill to Ghost Squadron," came the announcement from the control tower. Sarah could hear the surprise in the voices of the watching officials. The Academy ships were supposed to be superior in every way, but one of them had just been eliminated by a ship they considered obsolete. The Academy pilots regrouped and tried a different approach, spreading out to deny the Ghosts their mobility advantage. It was a smart move, but Sarah had anticipated it. "All Ghosts, converge on Academy 5, she ordered, picking the most isolated enemy ship. The Ghosthawks came at the target from 6 different directions simultaneously. The Mark 7's defensive systems tried to track all the incoming threats, but the computer couldn't handle that many unpredictable targets at once. Lieutenant Santos scored the second kill, her kinetic rounds finding their mark just as the enemy pilot's computer was switching between targets. Second kill to Ghost. Squadron, the tower announced. Now the Academy. Pilots were getting desperate. They abandoned their formation entirely and tried to engage the Ghosts in individual dogfights. It was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for. In one-on-one combat, the Mark 7 still had every technological advantage. But the Ghost Squadron pilots had learned to fight without relying on technology, and that made all the difference. Lieutenant Chen lured an Academy pilot into a turning fight, then used a maneuver that would have been impossible for a larger ship. The Mark 7 couldn't match the Ghosthawk's agility, and Chen scored an easy kill. One by one, the Academy ships fell to tactics their pilots had never encountered before. The Ghost Squadron was fighting a completely different kind of war, one that relied on human intuition instead of computer calculations. When the last Mark 7 was eliminated, the silence on the communications channels was deafening. The most advanced fighters in the Alliance had been completely outclassed by ships that were older than some of the pilots flying them. Exercise complete. Admiral Harrison's voice finally came through. All ships returned to base for debriefing. As Sarah guided her Ghosthawk back toward the hangar, she could see the expressions on the faces of the watching officials. Some looked shocked, others seemed impressed, and a few appeared to be reconsidering everything they thought they knew about space combat. The old ways had proven themselves once again. Now Sarah had to convince the Alliance military that this was just the beginning. 2 years after the demonstration that shocked the Alliance military, Sarah stood on the bridge of the carrier Intrepid, watching the largest space battle in galactic history unfold before her. The enemy had returned with a massive fleet, their technology upgraded and their tactics refined. This time they weren't underestimating human capabilities. Ghost Leader, we're reading over 500 enemy fighters approaching from multiple vectors. Commander Thorne's voice crackled through the comm. They're not making the same mistakes they made at Kepler 442. Sarah studied the tactical display, noting how the enemy formation had changed. They were flying in loose groups instead of tight formations, using older ships mixed with new ones, and their approach patterns showed they had learned from their previous defeats. I see it, Commander, Sarah replied. They've been studying our tactics. Behind her, the Ghost Squadron had grown from 12 pilots to over 300. Word of their success had spread throughout the Alliance, and pilots from every species had volunteered to learn the old ways of combat. The hangar bays of the Intrepid were filled with restored fighters from a dozen different worlds, all of them stripped of their computer assistants and modern weapons. All Ghost Squadrons. This is Ghost Leader, Sarah transmitted to her expanded force. The enemy has adapted to our previous tactics. They're flying like we taught them to fly. That means this battle will be decided by pure skill, not technological advantages. She could see the enemy fleet spreading out across space, their ships taking positions that would minimize the effectiveness of the hit-and-run tactics that had worked so well before. They had studied every engagement the Ghost Squadron had fought, and they were prepared. Ghost Leader, enemy jamming is affecting our communications, reported Lieutenant Santos, now serving as Sarah's executive officer. They're trying to isolate our squadrons from each other. Sarah nodded. The enemy had learned that the Ghost Squadron's greatest strength was their ability to coordinate without computer assistance. By jamming their communications, they hoped to force each pilot to fight alone. All squadrons, switch to backup frequencies and prepare for communication blackout protocols, Sarah ordered. Remember your training. We practiced for this scenario. The Ghost Squadron pilots had learned to fight as a coordinated unit even without radio contact. They used visual signals, formation flying, and predetermined tactics that allowed them to work together even when they couldn't talk to each other. Enemy fighters are breaking into attack formation, the tactical officer announced. Estimated time to contact 2 minutes. Sarah checked her weapons one final time. The Ghosthawk she flew now was different from the one she had used at Kepler 442. It had been upgraded with some modern systems, but it still retained the simplicity and reliability that made it effective. More importantly, it was still flown by a pilot who understood that technology was a tool, not a crutch. All squadrons, engage at will, Sarah commanded. Show them what human determination can accomplish. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had been seen before in galactic warfare. Instead of the orderly formations and computer-controlled tactics that characterized most space battles, this was a chaotic melee where individual skill and creativity determined the outcome. Sarah dove into the enemy formation, but this time they were ready for her. Enemy fighters swarmed around her, their pilots flying with the same unpredictable patterns that had once been the Ghost Squadron's exclusive advantage. The dogfight was intense, with ships weaving through space in patterns that would have been impossible to predict or program. Sarah found herself in a turning fight with an enemy pilot who was clearly as skilled as any of her own squadron members. She tried every maneuver she knew, but the enemy pilot matched her move for move. His ship was older, probably pulled from their reserves specifically to counter her tactics. It was smaller and more agile than the modern fighters, and its pilot knew how to use those advantages. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself in a fight she might not win. The two ships spiraled through space, each trying to gain an advantage over the other. Sarah's kinetic weapons couldn't find their mark, and the enemy pilot's guns were equally ineffective. It was a pure test of flying skill, with no technological advantages on either side. Sarah realized that this was what the enemy had been planning all along. They had studied her tactics, trained their pilots to fly like her pilots, and chosen equipment that would neutralize her advantages. The battle would be decided by which side had the better pilots, not which side had the better technology. It was exactly the kind of fight Sarah had always wanted. She broke off from the individual dogfight and pulled back to survey the larger battle. Her squadrons were engaged across the entire battlefield, and the fight was going both ways. Some enemy fighters were falling to Ghost Squadron tactics, but her pilots were taking losses too. Then Sarah saw something that changed everything. The enemy command ship was hanging back from the main battle, coordinating their fleet's movements. But it was surrounded by modern fighters with energy shields and smart weapons, the same kind of technological superiority that Sarah had originally faced at Kepler 442. All Ghost Squadrons. "This is Ghost Leader," Sarah transmitted. "I'm seeing an opportunity. Form up on me for a coordinated strike." She outlined her plan quickly, knowing that communication could be cut off at any moment. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was also the kind of unexpected move that might win the battle. Sarah led her squadrons in a coordinated attack on the enemy command ship, using the same tactics that had worked so well 2 years earlier. The modern fighters protecting the command ship were powerful, but their pilots had become dependent on their technology again. The Ghost Squadron pilots weaved through the defensive formation, their ships too small and too unpredictable for the automated defense systems to track effectively. Sarah's kinetic weapons found their mark on the command ship's bridge, and suddenly the entire enemy fleet lost coordination. But even as the command ship exploded, Sarah knew that this victory was different from her earlier triumphs. The enemy had learned, adapted, and evolved. They would be back again with new tactics and new strategies. The age of technological superiority was ending, replaced by an era where pilot skill and human creativity would determine the outcome of battles. Sarah had helped bring about that change, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As the enemy fleet retreated and the Ghost Squadron regrouped, Sarah realized that she had accomplished something more important than winning a battle. She had proven that humans could adapt to any challenge, overcome any technological disadvantage, and find victory through determination and skill. The Ghosthawk had started as a symbol of obsolete technology. Now it represented the future of human warfare, a future where the person flying the ship mattered more than the ship itself. Sarah smiled as she guided her fighter back toward the Intrepid. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new enemies, and new battles to fight. But today, humanity had proven once again that they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because of their technology, but because of their refusal to accept defeat. The ghost in the machine wasn't artificial intelligence or advanced computers. It was the human spirit, and it was still the most powerful weapon in the universe.